All right, welcome to this episode of the Comics Multiverse. Tonight we are talking with Bob Fingerman, who is running a Zoop campaign um, about his 40 years in the comic industry, and we've been following the campaign on the Comic Watch Crowdfunder Corner every Saturday. But I wanted to kind of meet Bob himself and hear a little bit uh, about his career and the campaign and all that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring him in and get to and meet him. How's it going, Bob?
It's going well. It's going well. It's a new experience. So see, even when you've been doing something for 4 decades, you can still have new experiences. So
Well, before we get talking about the Zoop campaign, I'd like to learn a little bit about you and your not only your personal history with comic books, but also kind of your experiences and journeys in the industry.
yeah, where to begin? Start me and I'll I'll just like a pebble gathering moss. I'll just take over. But yeah, where shall we begin?
Do you remember the first comic book you read, or maybe the one that kind of got you interested in, the format or the
Yeah, I mean, I can remember. Obviously, it's impossible it's kind of like when people say, do you remember where you were when the when Kennedy assassination? Everyone knows. I can't quite pin it down to the specific comic book, but certainly the earliest ones I can remember were all books that were in my dad's collection. None of them were comic books. They were books of like comic strips and things like that. So, the old paperbacks of Peanuts and Pogo and Lil Abner and stuff like that. That's what my dad had. He also had Jules Pfeiffer and Gay and Wilson, and also collections of Playboy cartoons. So there were a lot of early things that I saw, some of which maybe I shouldn't have been seeing, but all of which profoundly pointed me in a direction. These are the things where it was like, okay, I like a little of this, I like a little of that. Um, but in terms of like more traditional comics, it's funny because my mom was much more encouraging of my art and just drawing than, I mean, not that my dad was discouraging, but my dad was more influential in terms of what I drew because it was things I found at his apartment in his collection. My parents were divorced, so there was all this stuff that he had, and in a way, just by it being in the house that I didn't really live in, it felt more exotic and it was a little bit more seductive. And then when I would see the cartoons and think these are images my tiny little brain can process in a way that maybe I can try to emulate some of them. Very simple drawing, obviously, when you're very young is what you respond to most. Complicated, super detailed stuff, in a way, it's almost off-putting. At least it was for me, because it was just like, oh, it's too much visual information. But you look at something like Peanuts, very clear, very simple. I understand what's happening. But my dad would occasionally buy me these little digest-sized collections of Disney cartoons, and also a Bugs Bunny and Looney Tunes, and those were these little digest comics. And yeah, those, once I saw, because those were, I think, probably the first full color. Everything else was black and white. Once you show a kid full color, the world kind of opens up. So
yeah. And I heard you say that your mom encouraged your drawing. What was ultimately made you want to get into um, you know this doing that as a profession?
it's one of these things where it wasn't even really a choice. It just was. Once I started drawing and also writing, when I'd write little, short stories or whatever, the things you do when you're a kid, um, that was it. I'd made my mind up. I was that kid that all teachers hate, the kid who actually knows what he wants to do, as opposed to as kind of a malleable personality. I was very clear, for better or worse. I was extremely clear on what I wanted. And yeah, it's like a pit bull with a bone. That it's once I had it, it's like, okay, that's what I'm gonna do, like it or lump it.
Yeah. And so when you were starting your career, how did you kind of how did you start your career?
Well, I mean, starting the career was built on, I always had the desire, and pretty, for I always had pretty good discipline about drawing just because I wanted to do it. When you're doing something you want to do, it's not hard to find the time for it. So, I always drew. Um, but I did go to an art high school, and that definitely began to clarify things even more, because then I began to get a better sense of working with materials. When you're a kid, you draw with whatever's at hand. So if you're lucky, your parents buy you some nice magic markers, or decent crayons or colored pencils, whatever. But then going to an art high school, it's like, okay, here's oil paints, I'm getting a sense of that. Here's watercolors, I'm getting a sense of that. You begin to your path begins to get clearer. And then I went to a school after that called the School of Visual Arts, in Manhattan. My high school was in Manhattan as well. But I chose that one because they had a cartooning major. I think they were the only college level art school, at least in New York, that had a cartooning major. And their instructors were, Harvey Kurtzman and Will Eisner, and Art Spiegelman was, but he was on sabbatical by the time I got to the year I could get a major. So I missed out on Spiegelman, which is a bummer, because I had friends who took his course, and it sounded great. But still, can't complain when you've got Kurtzman and Eisner. And it was in Kurtzman's class that the career part started, because he actually hired me, as one of his students, hired me to work on an anthology. He was just putting together a kids humor anthology called Nuts, which was going to be done paperback format. And so my first professional work was working for Harvey Kurtzman, it's a pretty good start.
Yeah, pretty good. I mean, yeah, he was, he was an up and comer in the industry.
That's right. That's right. Yeah,
Um,
maybe someday he'd make something of himself.
Maybe he'll get his due someday.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't count on that, actually.
Um, so, um, so let's kind of segue that into the crowdfunding campaign. Tell us about that some business you're in.
Yeah, well, the title is courtesy of my dad. As I say, both my parents had pretty profound input also on not only work I did, but my worldview. And my dad, a nice way of putting it would be, he was a very world weary individual. And he did look askance at my career. And the title of the book is something he would say to me pretty much every time I would tell him about something I was doing for work. He would always just kind of shake his head and say, "That's some business you're in." And he's not wrong, by the way. Just because somebody finds what you do to be absurd doesn't mean it's not absurd. But it this being which is a shocking number for me, but 2024 is my 40th anniversary working professionally, and I figured I've worked for almost everyone, and I've done a lot of everything. Let me do kind of a look back at all of that, and sort of do it partly as a memoir and partly as a kind of coffee table art book kind of thing. So, there's plenty to read and tons of images. So, but it's been an interesting and weird thing looking back, because there's a lot to look back at. Because, in addition to the professional part of the book, which is 40 years, there's also a chunk that's everything that came before. So, the stuff I did when I was a kid and the first comics and all this kind of stuff. It's a cradle to not quite grave. look at my career. Hopefully we won't get to the grave part anytime soon, but anyway, and if I do, at least I can have a book that commemorates my time on this earth.
Well, as you mentioned, you've worked for, a lot of the different publishers. How has that uh, influenced you as a creator, as a artist, as maybe a writer?
Well, I mean, when you work for a lot of different clients, publishers, whatever you want to call it, especially the earlier part of my career, it's kind of work to order. It's you're fulfilling the obligation of why they hired you. So for me, my career has been great training because I did so many different kinds of things. The first regular work I did was, when I was very young, was for Cracked magazine. I don't know how many people watching this yet. Again, everything, you have to be a certain age. Cracked magazine, I think they folded up. They might have made it to the 2000s, but I'm not sure. They might have ended in the late 90s. I can't really say. And then, of course,
I
the
remember
brand.
getting a couple issues.
Yeah, I mean, it ended. It's interesting because I mean, obviously the website Cracked has nothing to do with the magazine. It's like they bought the trademark, they bought the logo, but then they just made this whole new thing, which to me was fascinating. It's like, why was Cracked a trademark you thought worth? I don't know, who knows? That's a whole other conversation. But when I worked for Cracked, it was amazing training because I got to do so many different kinds of things, which then led to other work. Everything kind of dovetailed into other work. So, you end up, I mean, my career really spans working for kids' entertainment all the way to working for adult entertainment and everything in between. And, I think the through line is there's always markers that make whatever I was doing clearly work I did.
Hmm.
It was always sort of my spin on whatever it was. Even like when I was working on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for the Archie imprint, I was, originally hired as just an artist, and I did a 3-issue thing for them. But then they said, "Ed, do you want to write one?" And that one was weirder probably than Archie usually did. It was not weirder than Mirage, but the Archie imprint of Turtles, I think, was fairly tame. And, then they let me write one, which ended up being a story about a little character made out of discarded human organs that becomes sentient. I mean, that's a little strange for Archie, but they let me do it. So, I had always hoped that there would be a toy made of that character. It was a little weird little guy named Inardo, and yeah, never happened. But it would have been
Yeah.
really, that to me would have been like one of those high points when you get a toy made of something you created. That's like winning an Oscar for a comics person.
No, as I was kind of looking through your work, as you mentioned, you've done stuff from kids stuff, which I saw you've done the Turtles, you've done Scooby Doo, all the
Yeah,
way up to minimum your own create your own thing, minimum wage, which is very adult.
yeah.
um, Kind of what for minimum wage, which was your own personal project. What was the influences of that, and well, what were you trying to tell? Were you trying to tell something with that those stories or?
Well, minimum wage was so specific because, it's not pure autobiography. I never wanted to do that because I always wanted to have the latitude to, mix chronology, add characters, lose characters, that kind of thing to just make it read better narratively. But, it was very autobiographical. So really, that was, in a way, the first really personal thing I ever put out. There were other things that were, um, the first original graphic novel I did was a thing called White Like She, where I wrote and drew it. And that was great. But after that, I really, in a way, almost had a little personal crisis of like, okay, what do I want to do with the rest of, not my life necessarily, but it's like, what do I want to do that I can really feel connected to? And so I thought, well, I should probably do something a bit more personal, but also, a humor thing. Humor's always been kind of the through line of everything I've done, pretty much. Even when I wrote, fairly serious horror novel, there was still humor in it, which
Hmm.
you don't necessarily always get in horror type stuff. But for me, humor's part of life. So if you want to have something that feels kind of real, there's always going to be humor, even in the darkest moments. So minimum wage was just kind of a way to do the classic cliche, write what you know. It was like, okay,
Yes.
I know some things. I started that right when I was turning 30. And that to me was, you have these milestones you hit. And I was like, okay, 30, that's a big birthday. What can I do to commemorate it in a way that feels meaningful? And that was creating minimum wage. Minimum wage really came from, very specifically from that. But even
Okay.
there, just to add one more thing, even there, it
Sure.
shows, because you only have the perspective you have at that moment in your life. And at 30, which is stupid looking back, or at least, I don't know, maybe stupid's the wrong word, but at 30, I thought, I've gained enough perspective to look back at the person I was in my early 20s. And even there, I was really so close to it. It's like now I look back at not only who I was, but how I portrayed certain things,
Hmm.
and it's very different. Things keep changing as you keep advancing on the game board.
Right. So I know you, like you said, you went to, you had, some of the, encouragement and stuff like that for teachers. Are there any other creators that you inspire you or you like to draw inspiration from when you're doing your work?
Consciously at this point, not very often. Earlier in my career, it was much more conscious, where I was either like looking at other artists and thinking, oh, I like the way this one does this or this one does that. And, I never wanted to ape anybody,
Hmm.
but, you learn things. There were a lot of the European artists, like when heavy metal debuted, um, that had a huge, huge impact on showing me comics could be more, because that European approach where everything was just so intensely beautifully drawn and painted and all that, and it was startling to me in a way, because it was just like, wow, you can do this. um so I would say the artists there, like guys like Richard Corbin and Mobius, I don't see a lot of their work in my work, but I know it pushed me in directions I wouldn't probably have gone on my own. Same goes for like the underground comics. Once I started seeing guys like Robert Crumb, and again, the overlap, Corbin did tons of underground stuff. So, that's the,
I, I was going to say I saw a lot of Crumb influences in minimum wage. That was just kind of me.
yeah, it's probably, yeah, because I mean, his stuff is so confessional. I'm not as confessional as that. I think for me, there were, like, for instance, to bring up, and it's so painful to say the late, but the late Joe Matt. Um, his stuff, his autobiographical stuff was like the pure uncut cocaine. Mine is the kind that's been stepped on a bunch of times, and it's got baby laxative and flour. It's got all these other things. It's a
Mhm.
different experience reading it, because it is a bit fictionalized. Joe, I think, looked at Crumb, because Crumb was so frank, and then Joe, it was almost like, hold my beer. I'm going to show you really frank depictions of warts, beyond warts and all. Um, and he was kind of coming up around the same time as I was, so things. I don't know what the timeline is for Peep Show, but I was very aware of Peep Show when I was doing the original run of Minimum Wage, and it was the kind of thing where I don't know if it necessarily influenced what I was doing, but I was very aware of how, in a way, brutally honest you can be. And to me, it was almost like, well, I don't want to go that far. I don't
Hmm.
necessarily. For one thing, I think I only got to know him a little bit. The one thing he didn't get, just this is all a sidebar, but the one thing he didn't really portray was he was much sweeter, and there was definitely a side of him. He was so good at depicting the bad side of him. He was not good at depicting the good side of him. And I don't know why he kind of chose to basically have an imbalanced portrayal of himself. But with my character Rob, who was not me, he was a stand-in for me, there was a little bit more latitude because, in a way, Rob was both the focal point, but also, it's kind of like the show Seinfeld. Seinfeld's the least exaggerated character. And that's
Hmm.
the way it is with a lot of sitcoms. Even the character they're named for, that character isn't necessarily the most interesting or, the most, it's all the side characters that kind of create the ambiance, and then the reader kind of lives through the main character because they're the one that's sort of the least wacky. So it's like, okay, I can
Hmm.
kind of use that character as my avatar. So Rob to me was more of an avatar who was a lot like me, but not completely like me. And he was also, even though I say, I didn't have the perspective, he was a younger version. So I could kind of have him react in less mature ways. He definitely as a character lacked perspective. So he could be a little bit more outsized in the way he'd react to things than you when you were older. So it was a balance. But there were definitely other comics I was looking at where you could see the different approaches. And then it was like, where do I want to fall in that kind of spectrum?
So, when you were putting this project together, what was it about Zoop that appealed to you as your crowdfunding platform?
Well, I thought, I mean, I'd looked at things like Kickstarter and Indiegogo, but with them, you're not just crowdfunding, you're also doing all the order fulfillment, and manufacturing. In essence, you become a manufacturer. You're manufacturing a book. It's like I am going to have to do. And I knew a couple of people who did their books through Zoop. Dan Panosian did
Hmm.
his most recent Urban Barbarian art book, and I thought, oh, this looks great. It's really nice production value. It's good paper. Blah blah blah. Just purely on a production side, it looked great. And then I started seeing some other things. They did one of those artist editions of another late artist, the late great John Paul Leon, whose work was beautiful. But they did the big Wintermen artist edition, and so I ordered that. John was a friend, and it again beautiful, just great production value. So I reached out to them to see if they'd be interested in working with me because, they're a publisher that crowdfunds. I don't look at them as a crowdfunding thing. They are a publisher that uses crowdfunding to put out their books, which I thought was very smart, because that way, basically, they're a publisher who's never at risk because
Hmm.
everything is already paid for. Um, and it just seemed like they had a really good handle on putting out books in a very nimble way, because that's the other thing. It's
Hmm.
like, I mean, obviously I still plan to keep working with traditional publishers, But traditional publishing schedules are usually very, like, you finish your book, and if you're lucky, it comes out a year later. And, especially when you get to a certain age, you're like, okay, that's a whole year. And with this, I know when the book is done and the campaign's over, boom, we're going to press. People are going to have the book in their hands, depending on whether it's printed domestically or overseas. If it's printed domestically, people probably will have a book in their hands within a month or two of the campaign being over. That to me is great, because it's very, it's not instant gratification, but it's as close as you're going to get with something like a 200 plus page hardcover art book. That to me is super appealing. So I think it will be appealing to anyone who supports the campaign, because you're not going to be waiting forever. Because the other thing I can say is the book for the most part is done. I'm just working on, there's always stretch goals. So right now I'm working on what hopefully we will get that stretch goal and adding another, 15 or 20 pages. But for all intents and purposes, the book is done. So that's the other thing. Anyone who's supporting this campaign, they don't have to wait for me now to actually do the book. It's done. So I like that. I like how nimble, as I say. I think that's a good word for it.
And I mean, the campaign fully funded pretty quickly. Did that kind of surprise you, or how was that?
Yeah. I mean, because the thing about doing a crowdfunding thing, this was my biggest fear, is in a way you're the most vulnerable you could ever be. Artists tend to be fairly fragile, snowflakey kind of people at the best of times. So when you're basically just saying, please fund this thing, you're exposing your belly, saying, okay, it's pretty raw. So for it to have been doing as well as it's been doing, it's very gratifying. But ultimately, I just hope more people, because I just want as many people as possible. For me, it's about people getting the book, So.
And it looks, looking at the different tiers, it looks like it's for what you're offering. There's some good deals out there that you're for people to if they decide to fund the campaign.
I like to think so. I mean, I've been hitting the archives and finding some art that I think is cool art that represents, at least some of the content of the book, and some of it I've never offered before. Some of the, especially like work I did for Cracked Magazine all those years ago. This seemed like a good opportunity to make some of it available, and maybe I'll make some more of it. Of every week, I'm trying to add some new things to kind of excite people and bring in, some new eyes and so forth. So, and I mean, the one that I added today is commissions, because I was thinking, do I want to do that? And I love doing portraiture. So today, there's a tier of available portraits. So just trying to keep it interesting for the add-ons.
Yeah, I saw that one of them is the Garbage Pail Kid.
Oh yeah, the homage. We have to call it the homage. Yeah, the Cracked Spokes character was a little creepy dude named Sylvester Smythe. So that was the Sylvester Smythe as a Garbage Pail Kid. The funny thing about that is, because I don't remember, again, it's all those years ago, but looking through some of the old issues, Cracked clearly did some kind of tie-in with the infamously bad Garbage Pail Kids, the movie. And I think everyone thought that movie was going to be more than what it turned out to be. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
No, no.
It's pretty amazing. I'll leave it at that. It's just kind of this low budget nightmare, but it's worth seeing. Like if it, people always say, "Oh, I love bad movies." "Oh, I've seen The Room 20 times. I've seen, Birdemic 15 times." Garbage Pail Kids movie should be in that pantheon because it's something, man.
So as we wrap up, I guess my well, two final questions would be what in the 40 years of your career has been like the most important takeaway or the important takeaway, or what would you want if you had the opportunity, what would you tell a younger Bob Fingerman that you know today?
Oh my God. It's the words of wisdom question. Wow. See, I like when people ask me a question I don't have a pat answer for. You're making me actually think. What I probably would have told myself is try a little harder and don't grab for the low hanging fruit all the time just because it's the most easy. Because I mean, I talk about this in the book. I'm not ashamed the way I used to be because I used to really feel actually quite embarrassed by a lot of what I did. And at a certain point, again, you get older and you look back and think, well, at least I did some interesting, weird stuff. And I worked with a lot of interesting, weird people. And that wouldn't have happened necessarily if I. But I think the two things I would have told myself if I could have. The thing is, I don't think young me would have listened. That's the problem here is would young me listen to older me? But I would have said, maybe try to do like, don't take rejection so personally. And if you're rejected, it's not permanent. Go back. If it's something you wanted to do, try again. Some places that rejected me, like, just as an example, I really wanted to work for the New York Times book review. I thought, oh, they have such cool art. And my rejection there was so severe that it was like, I never went back. I'd probably say to
Mhm.
younger me, get better and then go back. Don't go back right away.
Right.
Get better, improve your skills, go back. And the other thing I'd say is be happier. You know, I this is that thing about being young where really, for at least for me, I took everything so personally, and it contributed a lot to being a less happy person than I probably could have been. So I would say don't take things so seriously. Don't take it so to heart. Try to be a little lighter. It'll work better for you. It'll work better for the people around you. So there you go. There's my words of wisdom to young me, and hopefully other young people watching this. Yeah, it's impossible to have perspective when you're young because you haven't experienced things. But yeah.
Well, is there anything else about the campaign or the book that we did talk about that you wanted to make sure people knew would should know about?
Well, yeah. I mean, this is the funny thing is, it's like I'm here talking to you, promoting this. Self promotion's always felt a little weird to me, but it's necessary. It's necessary. So, I mean, to be a a little bit of a salesman, I would say it's a book. I'm creating a book that I would want to buy. Like, I'm very aware of when people are spending a certain amount of money. I feel like they should get their money's worth. Certain times you buy something and it's like, well, it's fine, but I don't really feel like it was worth the money. With this, where it's going to be in excess of 200 pages, hardcover, full color, lots to read, lots to look at, I think people will feel like, okay, this definitely, as a consumer, was a good purchase. But I also think, for people, obviously, if it's preaching to the choir, for the people who already like my work, they're going to see even the work that they're familiar with in a way that they've never seen it before. Because a lot of it's now scanned from the originals. So it's got kind of that artist edition look. Just even people who think they know my work well, there's going to be a lot in the book they've never seen or even knew about. And for people who aren't that familiar with me, I think this is a good way to dive in because it's really across the spectrum of my career. So, you know, that's what I would say. I guess that's my hard sell for this thing is
Okay.
if you buy the book, I'm pretty darn certain you're not going to regret it. And if you do, you'll give it to someone who will like it.
And are you on social media? And where can, if you are, where can people follow you?
Yeah,
And
I think probably the best place is Instagram because I do post a ton of artwork there. There's also a I don't think they call it a Facebook fan page anymore. Everything is they've changed the terms of things, but there's a public Facebook page called Bob Fingerman, cartoonist and writer, I think.
uh
If you put that in, you'll find it. But Instagram's probably the best of all of them because you get something fun to look at. Nobody
Okay.
wants. Nobody should be on Twitter well, it's not even Twitter. Nobody should be on X anymore. I am only sort of under protest. But
Understood. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time this evening to chat. And it looks like you have just under 3 weeks to go left in the campaign. So hopefully you will hit those other stretch goals.
yeah,
And
I hope
I
so.
I enjoyed chatting with you. And anytime you have anything new, coming out and you'd like to chat about it, would love to have you back.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And you asked me some good questions that were new.
All right. Well, that wraps it up for this episode. So we'll be back whenever with another creator, either wrote a book or their own another campaign, crowdfunding campaign.
Sounds good. All right, thank you so much.